why do grassroots movements tend to fail to gain traction? Like, why do they tend to peter out and have an increasing amount of their leaders' energy going toward just getting people to show up instead of actually making the good things happen that they have in their visionary minds? And I think this is related to the question of why do volunteer-based organizations never really have as much societal power and social power as, say, corporations and businesses? And I'm actually going to coin a term, the Grassroot Leaders Dilemma, which is exactly this. It's exactly the dilemma of how do you get people to show up when they don't have to? And then I'd like to compare it to corporations and to the power of, economic actors. And then I want to think about the relationship between financiers in the economy and these grassroots leaders. Because a lot of times, if leaders of these social causes want their visions to actually be enacted, or if they want to gain traction, they depend really heavily on the financiers who could allow them to hire people to work under them. And that, of course, creates a power dynamic that may be potentially destructive of the grassroots causes that they're trying to lead. First, let's just explore this notion of the grassroots leaders dilemma. And when I'm talking about grassroots leaders, I'm talking about people who are visionaries, who care a lot about a cause, and have some creative ideas for how to address that cause. And this could be all over the map. I mean, it could be environmental, it could be educational, it could be related to sort of children and family, it could be related to technology. There's a lot of different causes that many people might get behind the cause, and many people might actually get behind this person's vision. And if you mix that with a little bit of leadership ability, where some of these leaders might not just have a vision, but have skills at picking people for certain roles and inspiring people and organizing groups. And normally you would look at a leader like that and you would say, actually, it's people like this and groups of people like this who have the power to change the world and really transform things for the better. However, in practice, what oftentimes happens is that these people start off with a bang. Like maybe they have a big event where they get lots of people riled up and they get people to sign up for their cause, and they sort of start to wield the energy of people who are on board with their creative and transformative vision. But what oftentimes happens after that is they'll have these follow-up events that are based on sort of people showing up and nose to the grinder, working, doing the boring details that don't feel like you're making immediate progress. Or maybe you work a little bit and then something goes wrong, because things always go wrong. And no movement is going to take off unless you have a little bit of persistence in the population to sort of persist through the shortcomings of the people in the group, perhaps persisting through some of the shortcomings of the leader, persisting through setbacks. You need that sticking power. And that commitment, like that is sort of people showing up and saying, I'm going to commit to doing this through the ups and the downs, through the problems that we run into unexpectedly and have to figure out workarounds. I'm going to do the dirty tasks that nobody really wants to do but have to be done if this movement is going to take off. And you need people to be on board with that. So I think what oftentimes happens is when you rely on volunteers who don't actually have to show up, like they show up out of the goodness of their hearts, a few of those setbacks can cause people to throw up their hands, and that sort of diminishes the momentum of the movement. And I think anytime people see like members of the community falling off, like that person no longer thinks this endeavor is worthwhile, that leads to this this disengagement from the rest of the community, or at least a little bit of a ping in their commitment. And when you combine that with the fact that sometimes people don't show up just because they're not feeling great that day, or they're just not feeling motivated that day, like you add human mood and human tiredness and all of that into the equation, you get times when not as many people show up. That leads to this disappointment that can spread through a group, and in some ways that can almost escalate, causing more people to not show up. And I think oftentimes the grassroots leaders think that they're going to spend their energy sort of wielding the power of group dynamics. Because group dynamics, when people are inspired, are amazing. Like when humans come together, they can do things that no one single individual could ever do. And leaders start off thinking that they are wielding the full power of that group dynamic. But then once this downward spiral happens because people don't show up for whatever reason, and there's fewer people and people are disappointed and discouraged, leaders oftentimes find themselves spending more and more of their time and energy trying to convince people to show up, rather than spending that brain power actually shaping the vision and making the vision happen. It's more about inspiring people. And that can be a losing battle, especially when putting your energy toward getting people to show up pulls away from the visionary thing that people were committed to in the beginning. So that's going to be the Grassroot Leaders Dilemma. And I would like to talk about this in relation to financiers, because I'm starting to think of financiers as these key spigots in the economy. And if we're rethinking the economy in a creative way, then we need to really think carefully about the nature of those spigots. But before I do this, I want to point out something that a conservative friend recently told me about that really got me thinking. And it's the notion that this person was sort of looking back at, say, the 1950s and 60s, and they were saying during that time, a lot of the civic organizations and the grassroots movements and the, powerful social causes were led by women who were essentially housewives, where these women didn't have to work in the labor force. They perhaps spent some of their time raising their kids, but eventually those kids got old enough and these women could devote a lot of their time to these social causes. And the conservative argument here was, of course, that was really important, and that without those women in those roles anymore, we're losing a lot of the important social fabric and the civic organizations that makes communities whole. That was their argument. Now, of course, liberals are going to hear this and respond to this by being like, that depends on this power dynamic within the family where these women, even if they're serving these social roles, depend on their husbands in a way that has this power dynamic that we would like to get out from under. And I think a lot of the people who support, for example, universal basic income, they're kind of hoping that, okay, instead of having people's time free because they're women who have a husband supporting them, instead of that dynamic creating the labor for these social movements, we're sort of giving everyone this base income to where they could say, if I don't want to work, if I want to serve one of these social movements, then having the universal basic income frees me up, regardless of my gender, regardless of my marital status, to lead these movements. And so that's sort of one of the hopes of UBI. Now, UBI is complicated, and I'm not going to talk about the pros and cons in this video. But I wanted to bring up this notion of the power dynamic between, for example, the housewife who might be leading these causes in the 1950s and 60s, and her husband, that power dynamic. And I want to map that onto the potential power dynamic between grassroots movement leaders and financiers. because I think a lot of times these grassroots movement leaders figure out after a while that they actually need the money to hire people to work under them rather than relying on volunteers. Like eventually, if they try to do this enough, they're going to realize, okay, unless I can hire workers to work underneath me, this is just not going to happen. And at that point, they start to turn to the financiers. And when I say financier, I'm talking about anybody who is responsible for giving out enough money for people to hire people underneath them. So this includes bankers, it includes bureaucrats in the government who can give out money for various social causes. It includes rich people who are wealthy enough to actually finance not-for-profits and organizations. And of course, I think for these leaders to do what they want to do, to bring their creative vision into being, they know they have to depend on these financiers. And that in and of itself creates a massive power dynamic between those two groups. In which case, I think if we're going to bring out the white rabbit, and of course on this channel, the white rabbit is going to be me delving into new ways of thinking about the economic structure that are not fully baked ideas, but rather sort of pulling apart different mechanisms in the economy and looking at them and having weird economic thoughts, because we know we need some creativity in redoing our economy, like in redoing our system. And understanding new economic systems requires the kind of creativity that Alice in Wonderland experienced when she went down the rabbit hole. So this rabbit just represents, okay, yeah, let's take a minute and just go down a rabbit hole here. So the rabbit hole I'm just thinking about in this video is, I think the spigots of that money from the financiers, that is a key place for us to restructure power dynamics. Like, would there be ways to let smaller communities and smaller groups of people control those spigots of money that goes into these grassroots organizations in a more organic way? In a way that perhaps you can't eliminate the power dynamic between the grassroots leaders and the financiers, but maybe you could change the power dynamic between the general populace, who might support a lot of these grassroots causes, and who gets to embody those financier roles.